Hi everyone, so it has been quite a while since I last filmed making an Animal Crossing character, and I thought that as I was making Tom Nook it would be a good idea to record it and run a few ideas by you as well. I'm thinking about changing my videos slightly, and instead of showing the simple early steps like drawing out the patterns and cutting them out and so on, I thought about doing some specialist tutorial style videos, just because these are the kind of things that need to happen for every single piece that you make, but they are basically the same thing each time. Apart from the mask, the ears and the apron and tail for Tom Nook, everything else here is a pattern that I've reused. The face pattern is obviously slightly different to give him that extended muzzle, but actually that's just an adaptation of an existing pattern piece that I tend to use for my cat and bear characters. So you can see that nose piece here. One of my favourite tools is a rubber tipped pencil, just because I find that the rubbery end is really good at gripping things like polyfill. You can buy really expensive stuffing tools, but I find that a pencil works just as well. And the reason that I'm doing this here is because what I need to do is make sure that the mask that I designed for his face matches the scale of his pattern. So I'm just outlining here the parts of his pattern that make up his nose, and then drawing on just by eye really the size of his muzzle, so that I can roughly sketch out a mask over the top. Now you only need to worry about making one side of the mask what you want, so that you can fold it in half and cut it out. And I was pretty happy with this design from the word go, so I went straight on to cutting it out in felt. Now there's always a couple of decisions that you have to make when you are adding felt pieces to an existing design. One of the main ones is whether or not you want to glue them on, or if you want to sew them on. I will be sewing on the mask, but you can see here I've chosen to use glue for the eyes. The reason for that is because if you stitch over the top of something that you then want to add pen to, particularly if it's something like Copic markers, because they're alcohol based, they tend to bleed into the thread. So I often will use glue rather than thread on things that have fine details, just to avoid that being an issue. His belly here, you can see, also has a separate piece, but this was easier to sketch. Just outlined the darts that I use in the body pattern pieces, and then stitched them together, and then just trimmed the shape so that they matched roughly with how his body looked. This is another piece that I decided to stitch on, and I used actually a brown contrast thread here so that it would look a little bit more faded from a different distance, just as his belly does in his image. Needle nose pliers are a nice piece of equipment, really useful for pulling through small parts like his legs that you can see here, and also quite useful for pulling out small parts of stuffing. When you're stuffing the head like this, it's not something that you have to worry about so much because it's a round shape, so you can take small pieces and just use a pencil or another tool to push them as far into the head as you can get. But when it comes to something like the feet, it becomes a little bit more complicated, and I'll show you how I do that later on. As with all my wobble dolls, I'm using a wobble pin joint. This is something that I'd be quite happy to show you in a video. If you'd be interested, let me know in the comments below. Basically, it's just formed of using two different cotter pins so that the joint in between is slightly wobbly. You insert one of the discs into the neck with the cotter pins sticking out, and then ladder stitch it closed, which you can see that I'm doing here. Once it's all closed up, you would then insert the cotter pin that's hanging out of the head through the top of the body piece in this case, and then the two pins together give it a nice wobble in between the two parts of the pattern. Another nice use of the needle nose pliers here, just to turn down the legs of the cotter pin. You can get a cotter pin tool, it's not necessary, you can use these needle nose pliers instead. So you can see there the nice wobble on the head, really nice joint to use. So you can see here I'm using the needle nose pliers just to make basically leg-shaped wedges of the polyfiller that are already compacted. I find this is a much more efficient method than just trying to shove the right amount of polyfiller into the feet using something like a pencil. I just find that I can build up the right amount of polyfiller and get it right in one go. I then tend to stuff equally the neck and the bottom of the body pieces, and then kind of meet in the middle and add additional stuffing to the seams on top of everything else, just to compact the body and make it really solid. There is always a temptation when you start to make these toys to stuff them quite softly, but you'll find that the stuffing moves around and that causes problems with the shape later on. Now, because this is a design that I'm giving to somebody, my tag is going in there. So I'm just sewing it in as a little ribbon piece and then using the ladder stitch again to close the seam up, and you can see it's basically invisible. Now the arms are basically constructed the same way as any other body part. You don't need to worry about a joint here because I use thread joints in order to attach the arms. You can use wobble joints or cotter pin joints, but I find with these characters it's not that necessary. You do need quite a long needle, you can see it sticking out of my hands there. Not a nice thing to step on, I can promise you. And you use that to basically go through the body, as you can see, and through a small amount of the arm, back through the body, through the arm again, back and forth a few times, and then I tend to bring out the large needle and the thread so that I can lock it off on the base of the body where the tail's going to be, because I know that that will be covered up by the tail later on. So my next step is actually to design the tail, and the way that I do that is to draw on the outline of the body of Tom Nook in this case onto paper, just so that I know roughly how this tail is going to sit, and then just have a go, basically make it out of felt. I didn't worry too much about darts here because I knew that stuffing it quite firmly would give it that round shape that he has, and then just fold in the edges that will be flush with the body and stitch those closed with the ladder stitch just the same as you would do the body. With some of the characters I'll give them a little bit more of a loose thread sewing here so that the tail has more movement. Didn't really feel that necessary with him, but there is a little bit of movement in there. So one of the final stages that I'm going to show you here are the ears. Nice and simple, same kind of idea as you would get with the tail, but I don't tend to stuff the ears. And then you can see that I glued on the pink felt. Again, that idea of using the pen over the top, I don't want the pen to bleed into any stitch marks that are on the ears. Here I'm just eyeballing the rough dimensions of the apron because it's largely just a rectangle. I wasn't too worried about it being imperfect because I know I'll be gathering it slightly later, potentially to put on the ribbon. Just check it for size and then add on the little new leaf design that I had made earlier. Again, I'm going to glue this one. You could sew it. It would be easier to sew it by hand because the machine's going to struggle with those tight curves. And then I just stitched a piece of ribbon over the top of the apron and check that it would be roughly in scale. Now the ears at this point, the glue has largely dried, although you may spot one of the pink circles popping off because I accidentally caught my needle behind it and it clearly hadn't set properly. This part here is quite important, I think. This is where you add the ears on with pins rather than sewing them, just so you get the positions right before sewing the ears on, and you'd use a ladder stitch front and back to attach them so that they're nice and firm. Getting the ears in the wrong place is one of the main things I think that throws a design like this off, so it's really, really important to check that you've got them in the right place and they're equal. And then I decided to add on a few details here. You can see he's got some darker areas like on his nose and the tops of his ears, so I just used a Copic marker for that, but you can use things like pastels, certain paints as well, and you can use an airbrush too if you're feeling particularly fancy. One nice trick is to use sellotape, wrap it around your hand and use that to pull off any lint, any extra bits of fluff that you get from the stuffing that tends to get everywhere and felt really likes grabbing hold of it. You can use a ball-pointed owl to move any stuffing around that's inside of the character to make everything nice and smooth, and then you can see I'm using an iron here to take off any remaining friction pen marks from when I drew the patterns out in the first place. Just sealing the end of the ribbons with the match, don't worry, I'm not setting him on fire, and here he is complete. This is the second time that I've made a Tom Nook character, but I think each time you make one they're always going to be slightly different, and that would be the same even if you use the exact same pattern pieces, which you can see here I haven't been able to do. And because I happen to have her hanging around, here he is with his good friend Isabel. Slightly better morals, but they do make a cute couple. Thank you for watching.